Listen, if you're worried that Alpine is about to crash and burn even harder than it already has, don't be. Because now it's generating more positive headlines than the negative ones that we've grown accustomed to. And it offers an opportunity for a team denied by Formula One to get in via the back passage. You know, the one that the sport itself prefers, but I'm not one to judge. Granted, the handling of the team this season overall has been nothing short of embarrassing and even at sometimes depressing. But the turnaround in the last few months has certainly been noteworthy and it's given me pause for thought regarding this. It's only now started to make sense in the last few days as to where this team is going to go. Alpine Mercedes? It didn't sound right, did it? But what will become really clear is that all of this is a plan for the next phase of the Enstone operation that's been going on for about 40 years or so. And this is all in time for the new regulations, but it might also put the future of Jack Doohan in Formula One at considerable risk. And I thought that the Alpine Academy had learnt its lessons from Oscar Piastri. Clearly not! But I've got plenty more to say on this matter, so we'll talk about Jack later. Because ultimately, the name Alpine is becoming a bit of a vestigial tale sort of thing. The billboard that Renault adorned on its F1 team to promote its sports car brand, this was trying to limit expectations. It's not resulted in championship glory. In fact, it's completely collapsed after a couple of seasons where it looked relatively stable with Fernando Alonso there. But then 2023 and Bruno Faman happened. Basically, I like to think of it as the manifestation, the embodiment of corporate meddling getting in the way. Alpine and Renault sacking the likes of Otmar Safnauer, which was doing his best to try and get some sort of order and departments in place, and granted, Safnauer wouldn't have made Alpine really fantastic and winning championships all the time, but he could easily build you a good, solid, reliable team. But no, Renault thought they could do better by looking towards Peugeot and Bruno Faman, but no, he ended up getting sacked as well. I mean, he wasn't technically sacked, he was sent to the Viability department to go and live out his days in obscurity, but considering that no one's quite sure what's going to be happening with that factory and the employees over at Viability, this is effectively him being exiled from motorsport. And of course, the tension between Ocon and Gasly peaked, which was enabled by Faman. And then you look to what Fred is doing over at Ferrari and you just wonder, ugh, if only Renault kept him, they'd probably be so good. And he's French to boot. But then you've got to also think about what's been going on at Viability and the divisions between that department and Enstone. There's been lots of division and infighting. They really couldn't get one cohesive message on board. So you could easily say that all the criticism, the lack of results, is perfectly justified. This team deserves to be in the doldrums right now. But at the same time, in the last few months, kudos is equally justified to this team. I could easily say that this team is on the way to improving itself and coming out of it all the stronger. And you've only got to look at what's going on over at Haas with Ayo Komatsu on board. Sure, to begin with, he wasn't exactly exciting. He seemed like a boring choice. It wasn't a firecracker appointment to replace the likes of Gunther Steiner, but does that really matter where they are right now? They got flippin' Toyota next to them. That's a huge coup. And whilst I don't think the likes of Renault might get themselves a big coup like Toyota, I mean, I certainly think that Oliver Oates could do a decent job. And then you've also got to think about Flavio Briatore. Yeah, I was nervous and skeptical when he was brought back after his sketchy past and Crashgate, but give him his due. The work undertaken at that team with Oaks in charge of the day-to-day operations, it's resulted in a lot more optimism than pessimism. And yes, we've also got to remember why Flavio Briatore was brought in. He was there to take a look at the numbers, look what's going on over the factory, and decide whether or not it was worth it or not for Renault to continue providing power units to the team, or whether they should even be in F1 altogether. It's to come up with various scenarios, and it's clear that he's come to the conclusion it's not worth continuing with the power unit, that they should cut the jobs, and potentially 300 people's employment could be put at risk here, and all of the work they've been putting into this new power unit regulations for 2026, it could just be cast to the wind or something else. It's a really painful situation, and according to the people at Viability, the numbers for the 2026 operation was looking really good, that they might have learnt a thing or two. They might have invested the proper time and money into the project, and they might have actually gotten the power unit engine, which would actually be fairly decent, or at least right up where with some of the other ones, but sadly, we might never know. But then you've also got to look at what's been going on during the V6 turbo hybrid era. It's not been a fruitful one for Renault, and it's wild considering that Renault made the first ever turbo-powered F1 car back in the 70s. They pioneered the technology! And yet 2014 happened, brought on by their lack of understanding of the enormity of the new engine rules, and yes, you could probably throw external pressure from Red Bull into the mix as well, to ensure their V8s were at their best, since they were their de facto works team in the early 2010s. And no, this is not me coming up with another reason to cast Red Bull as the villain or anything like that. Renault underdelivered the 2014 efforts, and that effectively caused Sebastian Vettel to leave, and then all of the discord happening with Daniel Ricciardo jumping ship to Renault, and some of the chaos and their lack of results in the middle of the 2010s, it was just down to the fact their power unit kept blowing up. It's why Adrian Newey pulled back and almost retired from the sport. So a lot of the scorn and criticism aimed at Renault, it is, again, justified. And even after several years of trying to get to grips with the V6 turbo, this outfit couldn't really do anything before the 2022 engine freeze. And yes, you might be saying, well, they got third place in the constructors with McLaren, they got P3. And yeah, that's all very well and good, but you've got to remember, well, McLaren did a lot of other things as well. And with that in mind, you can see why the prospect of doing this all over again with a new power unit model would not be appealing to Renault or its team based in Enstone, which we have to remember Renault itself did not establish. Yes, Renault does have a very strong connection to the Enstone based team, but it started off as Toleman, which, as we all know, as we've been told so many times over the last few months this year, it was essentially the team that gave Ayrton Senna the green light to get into Formula One, and the rest is history. Monaco, Prost, 1984, there you go, need I say more. Then eventually, they almost shuttered shop in 1985. They ran out of money. The Toleman family then sold to Benetton, which was a little bit of an unorthodox thing at the time because they were mainly known for clothes, and they still are. And I didn't know this as a Brit. Benetton still exists. I came across one of their branches in Lisbon. The story future of the team isn't mainly about Renault. It's clear that their time in Formula One is wrapping itself up to the point where it might become just a mere stakeholder in the Team Enstone operation, like it has also historically been during the Lotus era. And then you've also got to remember 2015. They didn't supply engines to Enstone that year, it was Lotus-Mercedes. So Mercedes coming back to this factory, it's not the first time this has happened. Yes, it's sad in a nostalgic sense that Renault has now come to this situation where they feel like it's best to not even try the 2026 regulations and instead do what they're doing right now and selling off the F1 operation. But you've also got to look at remember what's been going on and the person they're bringing in. Flavio Briatore has been involved with Team Enstone ever since 1990, when he was appointed by the Benetton Group to become their team principal after having done so well being one of their franchisees. So he managed some clothes shops, and then that was okay to be managing Formula One. I mean, it worked out. I mean, Flavio is responsible for all of the team's glory, what with Fernando Alonso and Michael Schumacher. He can spot talent, so yeah, who would have thunk it? He was right there when McLaren started to fade in the early 90s from its dizzying heights in the late 80s, and Ferrari at that time, they were in the doldrums and very much giving John Alesi many headaches, and only Williams remained as a consistent opponent. And what I'm seeing right now with Alpine, as it might transition into a brand new entity, because I don't think they're going to be keeping the Alpine name for 2026, I think what we're seeing here is a reimagination of the Benetton model from the late 80s and early 90s in becoming an entity in its own right and partnering up with a big group. Because back in the day, Flavio Briatore and his team, they were managing to get a really good relationship with the likes of Ford in the naturally aspirated era as turbochargers were being banned. They came in at the right time and they made good in the early 90s, even before Michael Schumacher came about. They were certainly right up there in terms of constructors who weren't the big giants like McLaren, Williams, and I was going to say Ferrari, but they were still a little bit shaky. But this team has a deep root in F1's history. And yes, it's another British-based operation, but that's pretty much where all the work is, and it'll continue to be the same for a very long time yet. It's why even Andretti decided to set up a Silverstone base, because that's where you're going to find the best of the best, and that's why I think that that team will ultimately succeed, because they can get the people. Briatore is bringing the team back to its roots, starting all over again with a clean sheet, brand new facilities with outside investment. He's managed to convince the board and all of these Hollywood listers to be able to make this maneuver, because remember, they're stakeholders and it's in the best interest of the stakeholders for this to happen. And now they've managed to get a good team manager in Oliver Oakes involved for the next transition and trying to steady the ship and just stop all of the constant drama that we were seeing in the middle of the year. It was just getting ridiculous. It was actually getting really sad, because this was just too much to bear. But now if you think about it, with Oliver in charge and even with Briatore in the background, there's not really been that much drama, at least none of the negative stuff. There's been many surprising headlines and they go, ooh, they're trying to get that driver? Oh, they managed to pick up that staff member. Oh, that's cool. Oh, they gave Jack a chance. Oh, okay, that's neat, Alpine Academy, well done, you're actually doing your job. And, okay, again, later, that might not actually come to pass, but, yeah, there's a lot of good things to be said about the likes of Alpine and Team Enstone, and it's not just down to the fact that we actually got to see Jeremy Clarkson turn up with a brilliant case of Holstenlager. But it's certainly given me a lot of clues as to what this team is going to be called in the next couple of years. Alpine-Mercedes? Nah, that doesn't sound quite right, but Hitech-Mercedes? That sounds more juicy, and it makes a lot more sense. Now, Hitech may not sound all that exciting or familiar to newcomers to F1, but when you step back and look at their contributions to junior categories of motorsport, you can start to see that they have made their mark, and that Oaks isn't just some random chancer or lucky guy getting such a big deal or desperation tactic from Alpine. He's cut his teeth in motorsport for a good few decades, and he very much resembles the early career of one Christian Horner in that he was a budding junior racing driver and ultimately found out that he wasn't really cut out for it. And when Hitech GP was formed in 2015 off the back of the original Hitech Racing, he became one of their founders. And that was pretty much the case, what with the like of Christian Horner with Arden. And then, as we're seeing right now, he gets plucked into Formula One by a big entity to then run Alpine, much like how Christian Horner got chosen by Red Bull to lead their operation after they bought Jaguar. And it's also really telling about how old I am that Oliver Oaks, this team principal, is younger than me. Oh, I'm 38, by the way. And yes, I'm also aware that Hitech's history has been punctuated with investment from a certain Russian family whose son got into F1 off the back of a Hitech drive, but the credentials are also punctuated with good ones, like George Russell, who Oaks credits as being crucial in establishing the team as a front-running operation and to be taken seriously, and maybe have contributed to getting some good kudos with their F1 application. And this does actually make me think, and I will get the foam of doubt out for this, because it depends whether or not George Russell is able to do good over at Mercedes, because if things don't work out for George and Kimi Antonelli wipes the floor with him, or they find another person, i.e. Max Verstappen, to come over, if Toto is able to pull off that maneuver, then I think Toto might broker a deal with, if Alpine becomes Hitech, Oliver Oaks to make sure that George has got somewhere to go. Much like he managed to broker a deal with his best buddy Fred to then make sure that Valtteri had a job. He went to Alfa Romeo for 2022, and sure, it's not resulted in much in terms of results, and now Valtteri is looking at being 23rd in the 20 driver championship, but hey, Toto had his back, so I feel like George might get the same result. He might end up being a good team leader over at Hitech. Whether or not he's replacing Pierre Gasly or Jack Doohan or somebody else, he's partnering Gasly maybe, I don't know. But it does make me think that, hey, maybe there might be a future for George post-Mercedes after all. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself. The point of this video is that the turnaround of Alpine will not be as Alpine, but most likely as Hitech Grand Prix from the 2026 season onwards. The purpose of Briatore's involvement was to get some sort of perspective as to the viability of the situation for Renault, and whether or not it would be worthwhile to continue in the sport as a works team or just as a customer. And like I touched upon earlier, it's resulted in the Viability factory effectively being mothballed with nothing to do, and no one's actually quite sure what they will actually put all of their efforts into now. What kind of motorsport would Renault want to partake in or use all of the information and insight? I mean, it's all confidential information. It's not going to be shared. Unless the rumours that I saw circulating somewhere, I mean, I know that Twitter has been awash with many rumours that have been since dismissed, but I think I saw somewhere somebody talking about Chevrolet having some interest in buying up the Viability factory, and they're part of General Motors, and General Motors is planning to be a power unit supplier for Formula One after 2028, so having all of this there, sure, it might cost them a couple $100 million or something like that. I'm sure Renault will not say no to money, and also to ensure that their workers actually get some employment. It's a lot of information and insight for this current era of power units, which I think the likes of General Motors, badged as Cadillac, will be very much appreciative for. It'd be a nice little boost to their coffers and all the work they're doing with Andretti. Personally, I don't think that Renault would sell to Andretti because, as far as I can tell, what with Greg Maffei, the CEO of Liberty Media, now stepping down, that particular roadblock might mean we might see Andretti pull off an 11th slot result after all, but it's very early days at the moment. There are currently the Department of Justice investigations. There's a lot to still unpack at the moment, but that is one roadblock, and probably it might mean that Andretti doesn't need to buy out Renault from their slot on the Formula One grid. That Hitech could easily just roll in. I mean, their founder is running the Formula One team as their team principal, I think it's clear as day that it's going to become Hitech in the next couple of years, and I personally think that Vladimir Kim's involvement in the Hitech operation was to help accelerate their efforts in trying to get their FI application during their expression of interest off the ground, to make sure they had a budding investor willing to provide some additional revenue and capital, and maybe some eyeballs from Kazakhstan, into Formula One. But then reportedly, Hitech were rejected, and Andretti were the only successful bid to get out of the expression of interest campaign. And according to Total Motorsport via Automotorensport, one alleged reason at the time why Hitech's application failed, this has not been proved as of yet by the way, is that the teams and FIA opposed the ascension of Hitech due to the concerns that Vladimir Kim was acting on Dmitry Mazepin's behalf to perhaps get Nikita back into the sport, right in the middle of the conflict with Ukraine and Russia. But again, this has never been proved, it's not been substantiated, and so far Hitech continues to run uninterrupted, and if this is the way it's going to go, Oliver Oakes taking over an F1 team, surely Alpine, what with their storied history over the last couple of years, surely they wouldn't want any more controversy or dodgy wheelings and dealings going on. This also does make me think, and the article does go on to speculate, that maybe this might have been a reason to reject the application, and another reason why all of the existing teams might not want to have an 11th team. Oh, why didn't Hitech succeed? Russia. I mean, at the time, even now, you can't really argue against that. However, as has been suggested to Andretti by many, including Mohammed Ben Sulayem, the FIA president, after initially granting them entry on their own, perhaps buying out a current team wouldn't be so egregious. It might be better, it'd be good business, and Renault can actually make a profit and exit the sport with extra revenue in their pockets after returning to the sport in 2016. And this is all the start of a rebranding exercise which the Enstone base is not a stranger to, and one that I think would be quite fitting considering that Hitech's own base of operations is only 30 miles away from Enstone itself. Oakes as Alpine's team principal, Briatore the man overseeing the current restructuring, it's all pointing to a sale, and the team changing its name, as well as Renault ending its commitment to F1 in any meaningful sense. As for the team itself, is this move a good thing? Well, of course it is. I mean, you've only got to look at what's been going on. The headlines generated regarding Alpine, they have been so much more traditional, conventional, boring, borderline positive, which is exactly what you want with a team. You don't want to be caught in controversy, especially after all the controversy they had at the beginning of the year. You just want to get on with your job. I mean, it's certainly far better than the drama and tension that we saw between Monaco and Canada. At one point, Bruno wanted to sack Ocon, according to reports. Now imagine if that had happened. We wouldn't have had that double podium, that's for sure. And all the while, the team is doing its best to try and regenerate its facilities, add to the factory, make it completely self-sufficient as best as it can, because Enstone, even though it has a good reputation, is certainly looking a little bit tired, so it could do with a refresh. And it's also making Briatore feel a little bit frisky when it comes to driver acquisitions. We all remember the rumours regarding Carlos Sainz, now there's Franco Colapinto being involved, potentially. And, I've got to give Briatore points for trying, but that's certainly a little bit bolder. I mean, what can Alpine at the moment offer those two drivers? And yes, the 30-plus points from Brazil were earned due to the conditions playing a key factor. The car itself isn't capable of those results on the daily, that's true. But the team made the right call to stay out, and they kept their cool when in that position. They didn't bottle it, and that has to be acknowledged. But we also have to acknowledge that this car, this year, it's not a good one. Not at all. It's probably one of their worst. But the team is starting to get its act together, and that's only a good thing. It's got a good manager. I feel much more positive about it than I did back at the beginning of the year. And for a while too, I was really worried about Pierre Gasly. I certainly recall one of my earlier videos about saying Pierre Gasly had no choice, that he was locked in to this deal with Alpine, and that he couldn't really find a seat anywhere else. And you've also noticed that his rhetoric about being at a works team as that being the best thing ever, he's walked that back quite considerably and saying, oh, you know what, maybe works operation isn't that big of a deal. He maybe might have ingratiated himself as their team leader without question or pause. It's looking much better for the Frenchman. But then it doesn't bode well for his new teammate, Jack Doohan. Because if it's the case that we are starting to see Alpine maybe transform itself into Hitech, and the involvement of Renault and Alpine and potentially its academy starting to diminish, or maybe transform itself or merge with the Hitech junior operations or what have you, it might mean there could be a big glut of drivers who might be actually superseding Jack Doohan, not necessarily from the Alpine Academy, and we might actually see it shutter up altogether. I have no clue. That arm of the operation, it's very much up in the air at the moment, and I think Jack knows it. If he wanted a chance in F1, I'm glad he's at least got some chance. But before he's even had a chance to be in the Abu Dhabi test, there are rumours flying about his time in F1 being cut short. Some say he can have his contract torn up before the first race is run. Others say that he's only got 5 races to prove himself, not a full year. And even if all of these rumours turn out to be false, it's certainly not a good start for Jack Doohan that your contract and your career in Formula 1 is already in doubt, that there is something hanging over you, that you've got to prove yourself and you've got to be getting results and equaling the likes of Pierre, or maybe besting him if you want to actually see the season out, because there are a lot of young junior drivers out there who might want your seat. Or there could be people from outside of the Alpine pool looking for a second chance or whatnot. But at the same time, I can see where these rumours are coming from, because if Alpine is pulling out and Renault is no longer a majority stakeholder and doesn't have the best interests of its academy drivers at heart for the sake of, you know, wanting to try and make a quick buck or something like that, I do feel like Jack Doohan does have to step up and really prove himself. So far, he's not really shown me any concerns. He's been quite competent. He's been very solid. He's been a dependable person amongst the Alpine division. He's not been caught in controversy. I'm glad that, hey, if Mick Schumacher wasn't going to get a role at Alpine Formula 1, then at least a Doohan got it, because the Doohans and Schumachers, they're like that. But another thing that's filling me with a little bit of concern and dread for Jack is what's going to be happening in the final year where Vivi Châtillon is providing power units for Alpine. What will happen? Will they bow out with good grace and dignity and provide the best power units that they can, do their best job and try and get some good performance updates? What with reliability upgrades? Because that's the only thing you can do during this 2022 engine freeze, brought on by Red Bull powertrains and the like. It really depends on how they conduct themselves, because there is a very real chance that they could end up going on multiple strikes, protesting, working to rule, just pumping out shoddy power units in protest to really show it and stick it to Renault, but that might come at the cost of Jack Doohan's capability of providing good results. But that still doesn't allay my worry that potentially something could happen, because you get Luca Di Maio likening the tension between Enstone and Viry to the 100 Years' War, that they sleep in different hotels and that they don't really talk to each other, and I just hope that that can be just pushed to the side, they can bow out with good grace, and they can provide a really good power unit. So that means Gasly and Doohan, they can do a good job and actually justify a position in 6th or 7th in the Constructors, instead of having to rely on breakthrough results like we get in Interlagos. But one thing's for sure, I still feel a lot better for this team now than I did a while ago. Oliver Oakes, he's a good solid manager. He's not exactly lighting the world in terms of inspiration, but he's certainly just a nice guy, you know? And Briatore, he's running things in the shadows, and I think he's just trying to do what he did with Benetton, and look how Benetton turned out in the mid to late 90s. You know, they were okay. They were good. And in terms of Hitech getting this gig, I think it could easily happen, because they're playing the game that Formula 1 management wants them to do. Buy out an existing team. They're going along with things. They failed their application to be an 11th team. Well, hey, just use that revenue and capital to buy out an existing team, and Renault is certainly looking for a buyer, and they certainly want to look for one that has a really good smooth transitional period. So hey, get the founder of a prospective buyer to run the team. Effectively, Alpine is Hitech at the moment, so them changing their name, it won't be groundbreaking or a surprise. At least Enstone will survive. And speaking of surviving, Sauber have done well in getting Gabriele Bortoleto from McLaren to partner Nico. This could be a really good boost to Audi's hopes of getting the Swiss team back on its feet. And to find out, I think, why replacing Bottas was probably for the best for that Swiss team, go and watch this video next, straight after this one.